Please welcome Dennis McGinn, retired Vice Admiral of the U.S. Navy and former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and the Environment, and our distinguished panelists for Electric Transportation is a Win-Win-Win, realizing the full range of benefits.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How many people have electric vehicles? Wow. Okay, we'll be asking you a lot of questions.
Nice.
It is really great to be here among friends and colleagues, and especially to have such a distinguished panel to talk about electric vehicles, especially light-duty automobiles, if you will. We are at a very, very exciting time. It's kind of a tipping point. We are going to talk about this, as Lisa described, a win-win-win to realize the full range of benefits of electric vehicles. Our speakers will cover several different aspects based on their experience of electric transportation. From my far right, Estela de Llanos, Vice President, Clean Transportation, Sustainability, and Chief Environmental Officer, San Diego Gas and Electric. Estela, your name tag must be really, really big on your office. Michael Burraby, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary, Sustainable Transportation, U.S. Department of Energy. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have Britta Gross, Managing Director, Mobility Practice of the Rocky Mountain Institute. And last but certainly not least, Norm Sari, former Commissioner, Michigan Public Service Commission. And the bios of all of these distinguished panelists are in your programs. All of them have been involved with electric transportation for many, many years. We have a very knowledgeable and experienced panel, and we are delighted to have them here today to share their perspectives with you. Before I turn to each panelist, I want to start with the title, Electric Transportation is a Win-Win-Win. I believe that electric transportation clearly is a win for the environment. And that win for the environment is not just reduction of greenhouse gases, that certainly is a big one, but also the improvement in local and regional air quality, especially in urban areas. It is a win for consumers and a win for national security. As a retired admiral in the Navy and a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, I know firsthand what electric transportation means for both national security perspective and also from an environmental perspective. I've said in other forums that for many years as a carrier pilot, I kept wishing that the Navy would deploy an electric-powered airplane so I would only be able to fly in the daytime and in good weather instead of the nasty nights I had to fly off the carrier. But I want to focus a minute on the national security aspect, which Lisa mentioned. As this audience is well aware, gasoline vehicles depend on oil, a lot of oil. And even though the U.S. is now an oil exporter, we still import much, and much of each barrel is used to make gasoline. That oil comes from many, many different places, but the events of the past week to 10 days, what happened to the terrorist attack in Saudi Arabia, just reminds us once again that being able to be less dependent on this global commodity is going to be an enhancement to our national security. As you are all aware, electricity is produced using our domestic resources such as natural gas, nuclear, coal, hydro, wind, solar, geothermal. And to the extent that we can use domestic sources to fuel the transportation sector, this improves our national security. As Lisa mentioned, today there are about 1.3 million electric vehicles on U.S. roads. As the number of EVs grows, and I believe it will grow exponentially over the next 5 to 10 years, more vehicles use electricity and our dependence on foreign oil declines. That's why electric transportation is a big win from a national security perspective. With that, let me turn to our panel. Estela, I'd like to start with you. You wear several hats, that long name tag at SDG&E, Clean Transportation, Sustainability, and Chief Environmental Officer. And you're in California. I've heard they've done some things with environmental things in California.
A thing or two.
Ambitious environmental goals, and I would add accomplishments. Please give us your perspective on the environmental benefits of electric transportation and why it's so important today, not just in California, but across the nation.
Thank you, Denny. Well, you touched on some of the environmental benefits, and I try to make sure that we're always very focused on both the climate change aspects, which are huge, potential benefits there, as well as what you mentioned earlier, which is the very local potential impacts, in particular on communities associated with toxic air contaminants. We don't want to forget that. We're talking both about very big global emissions, as well as that child who's standing next to the school bus lined up for class, breathing in the diesel exhaust. And here, California has really done a lot, as you mentioned, with very aggressive climate change legislation, which includes some greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we're trying to figure out, frankly, how we're going to get to. We have a 2020 date by which we have to get to our 1990 levels of GHGs. We've done that. We're at about 1.5% below 1990 levels. But then the requirements ratchet up. In 2030, we have to be 40% below 1990 levels, and in 2050, we have to be 80% below 1990 levels. And so as we look at how we're going to meet those requirements, as well as other requirements, such as getting 100% of our electricity from clean energy sources and being net carbon neutral by 2045, we're focused on the transportation sector for a few different reasons. One is, and we experience this at the national level as well, the transportation sector is the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. At the national level, transportation is about 29% of our GHG. In California, it's about 40%. And then turning to San Diego, it's even higher. It's about 54%. So over half of our greenhouse gas emissions in San Diego are from the transportation sector. This represents a huge opportunity for San Diego in particular, but also California and the rest of the US. We also have a couple of other policies that are focused on increasing the number of zero-emission vehicles in California for this reason. And as we look to integrate more and more renewables, in particular solar, we want to get people charging their vehicles at certain times of day. And we've had pretty good success at this in San Diego, where we have a particularly high penetration rate of solar on our system. We're at about 45% renewable energy today, and 15% of our residential customers have solar rooftop. So what we do in the next several years, I think, will be something that we can roll out in other parts of the country.
Great. Michael, let's turn to the cost of EVs. We all know that cost of EVs is still a barrier to many folks, and a big part of the cost driver is the cost of batteries. As those battery prices go down, so will the price of the EV. You're very engaged in DOE on battery research. What do you see in the future, and how quickly do you expect battery prices to come down?
When you look at, you put it in perspective, about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we were at well over $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Last year, we at the DOE spent a significant amount of research and resources on new battery chemistries and battery cost. We were at $197. We will now, at the end of this fiscal year, which is in just another week, we will declare that we've achieved this year's target, which is $185 a kilowatt hour. So it gives you a sense of the magnitude of cost reduction. However, in order to be cost parity with let's say a passenger car, lighter duty passenger car, you have to be at $80 to $100 a kilowatt hour. So we have to make a significant reduction still from where we are. But I worked for a CEO once who said, hope is not a plan. And I think that's very true.
I worked for a guy that said, what interests me should fascinate you.
Well, the same guy here, maybe.
Steal that one.
But that's how I think. So the work that we're doing at DOE is we're not just kind of going out there and investing in this project, that project, hoping it kind of brings new costs. We understand very well the current lithium-ion chemistry. That's a chemistry that was developed by the national labs, which are all part of the Department of Energy and the research program we have. We know that current chemistry probably cannot get down below $125 a kilowatt hour. Now, $125 will be very good. In some cases, commercial applications, maybe some heavier vehicles, that could be at cost parity. But again, our goal is to get to 80 to 100, officially under 100. So we are investing in the next generation chemistry and the next generation chemistry beyond that. Right. We're investing as well in solid state instead of liquid electrolyte. All of those things together, we know what each one's barriers are. We know what the problems are. And I guess what gives me some confidence is that when we look at each one of those, it's not like we have only one pathway. We have multiple pathways to break down the barriers for multiple different technologies. When we go out and put research requests out there, we often will get hundreds of applicants with good ideas. Maybe we're only funding 10 or something. But the point is there's a lot of good ideas out there. So there's still a lot of runway to come. Our official target goal is by 2028 to be at that $100 level. So now that's a level that it could take, depending upon the technology, a few years to up to 4 or 5 years before you see it in actual production at big volume as people ramp up.
Right.
Although currently we're seeing that it's only taking maybe a year or two from the technologies we're developing to get that technology into the marketplace.
Pretty fast adoption rate.
Yeah.
And when we talk about cost parity, are we talking the cost of buying a vehicle comparing to internal combustion? Do you think about the cost of ownership? We can come back to that.
Right.
later.
No, we look at both. In our calculation, that is just under a 3-year payback period is what we use. So working with the auto industry, kind of looked at that. If you looked at the full life cycle, it'd be even better. But typical consumer is not going to look that far out.
Norm, you're a distinguished graduate of the Michigan Public Service Commission. And during that time, you brought together a very diverse group of stakeholders to develop an action plan for EV adoption in Michigan. Why was it important to bring them together? Who were they? What was the role of electric companies in Michigan to do this? And what was the outcome of the plan and the work that you all did?
Sure, and let me put as many metaphors and cliches in as possible. We were the agency that had to make sure that the electrons met the road.
Right.
We were the ones that necessity was the mother of invention, and that was our responsibility. Failure is an orphan, success has 1,000 parents. All of those things were good, but
54-40 or fight.
well, it's actually 56-20 and 1, because in the Michigan legislature, if you want public policy to come through the legislature, you need 56 House members, 20 senators, and 1 governor to sign it. But if you want good regulatory policy that withstands the lobbying community and has the ability to put good public policy in effect, you need 2 out of the 3 commissioners, and actually it was all 3 of us commissioners who combined. The Michigan Commission, as so many state regulators have done before us and after us, you start this premise with, does anyone really care other than the utilities who think that they're going to sell some electrons?
Right.
Well, we found that there's a number of organizations and entities that did care. The environmental community, from the NRDC from San Francisco came to visit us. The Sierra Club from Denver came to visit us. The Michigan Environmental Council came to visit us. EEI came to visit us. So there were obviously the auto manufacturers and Center for Automotive Research and a lot of other organizations came to say, we want to be part of establishing public policy, not just determining what a rebate program is, and I'll speak about that maybe tomorrow. But the Commission's responsibility was to take a look at success that was defined by the California Commission, the State of Washington Commission, and other commissions that said, let's take a look at pilot programs. We defined the pilot programs. The pilot programs were, after a series of technical conferences, look at the 4 bases. Education, education is certainly number 1. Impact on the grid, pricing, and infrastructure location. So if you had those 4 areas that were going to be discussed and covered by this diverse group, this diverse audience of constituents, we thought we could come to good public policy, which the Commission did and said, okay, now it's up to somebody else. Investor-owned utilities, who the Commission regulates. If you want to come in at a rate case and propose some pilot programs that will go through the same sort of on-the-record hearing process, looking at these areas. Then the commission will make the determination whether or not there should be ratepayer funding for these programs. And we have two major IOUs. We have more than two, but the two major IOUs in Michigan, DTE Electric and Consumers Energy, both came in separately with aggressive programs that looked at how they were going to engage the public, how they're going to engage the manufacturing community, how they're going to engage site hosts, how they're going to look at where and how is this electrification going to work on Michigan streets and roads, and with hopefully product that was going to be made in Detroit, Michigan. So after we take basically 10 months for public hearings, there were all of the above mentioned organizations had their input. So now we've gone from the discussion to the implementation stage. And each of the utilities is responsible for its own program, and they're responsible for reporting back to the commission. What we're finding is really support, but also the fundamental issue is still education. Short of a ride and drive where everyone is required to take a ride in an EV, there's a lot of misunderstandings. You can drive them through a car wash. They're not going to short out, okay? So there's so many programs that the public hasn't understood about EVs. Range anxiety is resolved, and it isn't a matter of what your range anxiety is. It's a matter of deciding that you didn't want to have range anxiety, and you either plugged in or had a hybrid, obviously. So these issues that weren't previously looked at we're roughly 6 months in, and I won't speak for the utilities. They're very eloquent with how their proposals went, but we're making steps forward. And while we're doing this in Michigan, so are 49 other states. But more importantly, and you spoke to this, Admiral, the world has recognized that electrification is the key for their future transportation too. And I think it's incumbent upon us as regulators to set good public policy. We're not waiting for, in the state, for the legislature or for the governor's office, and we have great regard and support, and they have our budget. But we are most importantly looking at engaging those stakeholders in technical conferences, in pilot programs. And so now let's put those programs to work. Let's see what's successful. It's a 3-year program, and we're going to learn from that. We're going to stumble, but we're also going to learn how to take those steps, to take that pace, to then, as the industry is maturing with electrification, so will the regulation, and so will the role that the utilities and their state regulators have.
It's a great example of collaborative regulatory work.
Cooperation, collaboration,
exactly.
All
That's
of that.
Really
it's
key. Great.
Many other states have done it with varying levels of success. The important thing, though, and I think I heard this in Top Gun, engage, okay? So we want people to be engaged on this program.
Super. Britta, I'm all out of questions. You have anything you want to ask these fellow panelists?
Oh, let me add
What's in your garage?
Let me add it.
Seriously,
Yeah.
as managing director of mobility practice at Rocky Mountain Institute, and especially your former role as director of advanced vehicle commercialization policy at General Motors, you kind of know your way around electric transportation. So give us your perspective on why electric transportation is a win-win-win, especially for the consumers, grid, and the environment.
Yeah. So first of all, I thought that was fabulous what you guys just walked through, all 4 of you. Let me just maybe recap, because a lot of you have touched on the wins, and I would say it's not just win-win-win. I could probably list win-win-win, win-win-win-win-win, because there's nothing about electrification of transportation that actually isn't a win for everybody. If we can get past some cost hurdles, and Michael's working really hard at the DOE, as are the automakers and the battery manufacturers, that's the only thing that stands between us and the tipping point. If the battery costs come down, consumers will want to look at this technology and they'll want to adopt these vehicles. But let me sort of recap sort of the top couple or few win-win-wins. Number one, the environment, and Estelle, you talked about the numbers. Let me just go over those one more time. Nationally here in the United States, 30% of carbon emissions come from the transportation sector. It passed, as a bunch of you know, about a year or two ago, it passed the power generation sector, okay, for the first time. So 30% of all carbon comes from transportation. 60% of that, 30%, comes from light-duty vehicles. So if we want to attack one problem, we're going to attack all of them. But if we want to attack the largest sector of carbon emissions, light-duty vehicles in transportation, which is the #1 sector, this is what we have to do. We've got to get these vehicles onto electricity. As far as local emissions go, transportation also causes 55% of NOx local emissions. So it isn't just global, it's very local in our communities. The grid is getting cleaner than it ever has been before. Since 2008, when we were at 8% renewable wind and solar, we are now at 18% a year ago on the grid, wind and solar. A stunning acceleration because of the cost curve, right? The affordability and cost effectiveness of wind and solar. So as the grid gets cleaner, every day you drive that electric vehicle, you're driving a cleaner, and the next day cleaner and cleaner vehicle. The grid is also, the economy is also a second really, really major win. The economy wins whenever this country aggressively invests in itself. It invests in high tech, it invests in renewables, it invests in autonomous technology, it invests in electrification, it invests in ourselves, it invests in patents. That is great for the economy. And when I go back to sort of the health effects, taking people out of the workforce because they've got local asthma issues or issues caused by asthma due to local emissions and so on, that takes people out of the workforce. That is not good for the economy. So every time we pay to save ourselves from carbon emissions and local emissions, it is a drain on the economy. So the economy wins when we electrify cars, buses, trucks, and so on. It's also really good for the grid. Electrification is the single largest, smartest, and most flexible load we've ever seen on the grid. Probably more so than kitchen appliances back in the 50s and air conditioning in the 80s. It is the biggest load. And there's this huge opportunity to be able to move around the way we charge our vehicles at work during the day to optimize the solar energy coming in, and at night to optimize and take up the wind that's blowing on the grid. A huge flexible load where there are huge advantages. And then finally, I want to talk about just consumers win. Consumers win because these vehicles are inherently better to drive. They are quiet. You're almost in stealth mode as you creep into your driveway at night.
That can be very important sometimes.
You know, teenagers should be all over this. 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds should be all over electrification. But they're better to drive. They're smoother. They're quieter. They're fast. And the drivers have less stress because you don't have the vibrating from a combustion engine on these vehicles. So that's number one. Number two is just, it seems to consumers that it's a big deal to plug in your vehicle every night, but it's a 7-second operation. And in 7 seconds, in the convenience of your safe garage, you're plugging in your vehicle. And that's a huge benefit to consumers that consumers have still not recognized. And we need to get past that. And then finally, I might say that I think consumers and all of us win when we drive electric because we know we're doing our part. We know emissions from transportation, we know they're bad. And we know we can do our part by driving electric vehicles. So I thank everyone because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you asked this question, almost no hands were raised. So I thank everyone personally because that's the number one way to get somebody else in an electric vehicle is to show them that you're in an electric vehicle.
You know, if I may, I'd like to punctuate a point, Britta, about the grid and how we're able to optimize it. The experience we're having in San Diego right now is that since SDG&E's portfolio, our electric portfolio is about 45% renewable today, which is amazing. And the data about the electric vehicles that are charging on our programs at workplaces and homes is that they're charging at exactly those times we want them to charge because the system has a lot of solar or wind. And our most recent report, which we'll be filing to the State Public Utilities Commission, indicates that our EVs are 78% renewable because they're charging at the right time. So that's breaking news. You heard it here first.
It's phenomenal.
So we really got the message that it's the cost of EVs in many ways that are the barrier, the last speed bump, if you will, to cross to really get widespread adoption. What about an electric vehicle tax credit? Norm, did that come across your radar scope when you're commissioner? And
well, I'll answer the question first of all with an answer, then I'll probably elaborate a little bit. But no is the answer.
Yeah.
And a regulator isn't concerned with the economics of the vehicle. A regulator isn't concerned if you're going to spend $30,000 or $70, or get a Porsche Taycan for $200,000. Our role and our function is to make sure that if you plug it in, the utilities will be able to supply you with the electricity when you need it, where you need it. And I also like the idea that this is smart charging, not fast charging. Okay, so in the time of day, the use, the locations, all of the issues that you addressed in San Diego are issues that we have to address to make sure you're charging it at the right time, at the right place. In terms of vehicle, the tax credits, I know EEI is very active in that. I believe there's quite a bit of activity tomorrow on the Hill on that. So I would say go forth with strength and vigor and bring back whatever successes you can. Britta?
And I would say that there's nothing more important than incentives, and we know that's true because we know that's what's driven Norway, the Netherlands, and China. And you take away the incentives like they did in Georgia, and you see what happens. A market plummets. So incentives and addressing the upfront cost, because I think if you look at the total cost of ownership over the lifetime of a vehicle, we're there now. You can actually justify the upfront cost of these vehicles, and especially the used car market. Are you kidding me? Because the fuel is so cheap, especially if you work with your utility and charge at the right times on the grid. But the incentives really matter, and it's the number one thing you can do. So that incentive is the number one thing we ought to be doing today.
Maybe just to build at this question of charging at the right time, smart charging is really critical, because as we scale up from current levels of penetration, which have certainly grown but still are relatively small, and you start scaling up to bigger levels, and certainly if you start looking at fleets that are centrally fueled, whether they be TNC companies or they be a transit district or a big freight company, you have these point loads, right, that can get very big. And the promise of EVs are low operating costs, right? Higher upfront cost, maybe at one point we get that to be at parity up front, but it's the low operating cost. But you only get low operating cost if you're charging either the right way, at the right speed, how fast you want the electricity, you need the electricity, how much you need it, those demand charges are real, because that's real cost. So having smart charge management where you can go beyond just a simple adjusting it by a rate case, but actually have smarts between the vehicle and the grid, that's what you can need. When you have millions of vehicles in one service territory that you're having to manage simultaneously, or if you're a company and you have, UPS, you have 1,000 trucks at one depot coming in and out times a day, you really need to have a lot more smarts and intelligence. And that's going to take some technology on the utility part as well as on the vehicle part.
In many ways, it seems that automobile manufacturers may be ahead of the public, looking ahead at anticipated demand. A couple of years ago, there was Tesla, there was the Leaf, there was the Volt, and then the Bolt. Now I think there's probably a dozen or more, including, God bless, pick-em-up trucks like the F-150 or Silverado, that within the next 3 to 4 years are going to be out there available on the market for everybody that has a need for a pickup truck. So thoughts on that? What is the industry looking at in anticipating this market demand?
I think the industry was hoping for more success 10 years ago when the Leaf and the Volt first rolled out, the Chevy Volt rolled out. I think it's proven challenging to talk to consumers and get them to understand, first of all, the very complex plug-in hybrid that goes electric for a while before it switches over to the gas side if you want to do long trips. So that was one thing, is the awareness issue that Norm also talked about. The awareness is just, it just can't be overstated. So I think 10 years ago, it could have gone much better. I think the scary thing for all of us in here that we should understand is that electrification is going to happen. It's going to happen in China. It's going to happen in Europe. And if we don't jump in front of this and make it successful over here, we will lose out on the technology. And if you lose out on electrification of the vehicles, you probably lose out on autonomous vehicle technology as well, because that's the basis for electric vehicles. And we need the infrastructure, we need the awareness, we need those policy enablers that make the market strong. We have to get customers involved. We have to make it much more favorable to go out and purchase an EV than to decide, again, to go purchase a gasoline-fueled vehicle.
Right. Michael, in your travels around DOE, and especially with the National Lab System, do you sense is there any sense of urgency about not losing that technological edge, or certainly trying to regain it to the extent that China seems to be ahead of us in terms of transportation electrification?
No, absolutely. I think from DOE's perspective, we view really having a commanding place in this going to be trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar industry is critical. I will say I spent a lot of time around the world, including in China, I believe we are the technology leaders in fundamental battery technology. All the battery technology breakthroughs have come in the US, although when I go to China, I always go to Japan and see the best they have, and we get access, it's pretty amazing, to a lot of what's there. I think we still have the technology leadership, but that's very different than the manufacturing leadership. When I leave here, I'm going to leave for a meeting we're having out on the West Coast to summon a broad range of industry folks to look at what does it take for the US to have a commanding manufacturing leadership. The reality is there are more electric vehicles now, significantly more in China than any place in the world. Europe has now just passed the US as well. And to some degree, you do manufacture and worked a long time in the auto industry where the demand is. So to the degree that the US is probably going to be a little behind over the next 5 years in actual adoption and sales of EVs by most forecasts, the manufacturing might also be there. But if we can command and own some of the manufacturing technology and innovation, which we've been very, very good at, the processing equipment, then we have a shot of being a significant player in that battery manufacturing industry.
It brings the question of standards, or perhaps even standardization in some cases. If this were 2 or 3 decades ago and we were talking about video recording, we'd have the great beta versus VHS debate about which format was going to win. From a technological standpoint, and Estella, I'll have you follow on. What are your concerns and what are your hopes, as far as hope is not a strategy, I recognize that. But what are your perspectives on standards?
You know, there's the consumer perspective, which I think is very important. When you go to charge a vehicle, we're still very much in the early days of a charging system developing. Charging at home, relatively straightforward, but when you want to charge outside, what network is it, what system? So having transparency and having interoperability at that level is going to be critically important. From a technical perspective, I think we are largely, there's a group called the United States Advanced Battery Consortium, USABC, co-funded by Detroit 3 and DOE, well watched across the global industry, and it is very much a global industry. Society of Automotive Engineers, SEE, sets standards. So I think for the core battery technology, the charging, the smart charging, there's work to be done, quite honestly, between the utilities and the OEMs on standardization. I think that is an open space. We recently convened those 2 groups of senior technical executives to talk about that. And I think we can do some work there.
Yeah. Estella, what kinds of conversations are you having, is your company having, and others in California with OEMs?
Well, so I'd like to echo the point, actually, that we still have a lot of work to do. We'd like to get to the point where we can utilize the grid to be that traffic cop between all of the distributed energy resources, so not just the vehicles, but also the solar panels and other batteries that might be on the system. We've gone from a system that, from a utility perspective, used to be very one-way, right? We'd generate the electrons, we'd transmit them, we'd distribute them, they'd go to your home. And now we have solar, large scale, as well as on a home, on a rooftop, and we've got these vehicles. We aren't yet to the point where we've gotten the standardization to where we can fully utilize that grid to be the flexible resource that we need when we have very high renewable energy output, or when we don't, and we need to draw on some of those resources that are out. So the conversations that we're having involve looking at fleets that might be able to serve as that flexible resource as part of our recently approved medium and heavy duty vehicle program, which will include 3,000 chargers for various kinds of medium and heavy duty vehicles. We do have a pilot attached to that where it's a vehicle to grid, trying to figure out what are some of the roadblocks that we've got to utilizing those distributed energy resources. Right. We'll see where that takes us, but we're still at the very early stages.
Great. Norm and then Britta, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say what's critical for us to keep watching is the advancement of technology. You know, the 110 volt line that you used to plug in, and then it was level 2 charges. Now DC fast charges at 300. Now you got 800 volt chargers that are out there. So that'd
really do something in a car wash.
Well, I wash it at home. Okay. No, but you see these developments and whether or not it's going to go to solid state for batteries. I'd also like to comment on the advancement of technology as you look at vehicles. And I think if you would remember, maybe you and I could probably remember when The Graduate, the movie, Dustin Hoffman, the pool party, his graduation, what was the one word? Plastics. Well, now that one word is Rivian, because Rivian is that new truck manufacturer in Plymouth, headquartered in Plymouth, Michigan. Ford has already bought part of that. Other large organizations are buying part of that. But it's showing what these, I think the other phrase is, basement Tom Edisons are doing. They're developing a technology and developing a manufacturing application that doesn't address today, but it addresses tomorrow in the future. Right. And I think the more you see that American ingenuity in manufacturing R&D going on in California and Detroit and Washington, D.C., I cover all the spaces that way, I think is, in Denver, is more critical as we're looking at where's this whole electrification going to lead us to places that we haven't visited before, I'm sure.
Right. So, Britta, in your experience, if you think about electric vehicles in the total environment, the total operating environment, it's going to be operating on roads. So we've been able to do a marginal job at maintaining our roads and bridges using something called the gas tax. Any thoughts about how we collect revenue for public works to be able to accommodate this shift from something that uses gasoline or diesel to something that doesn't?
Well, when only 2% of all vehicles on the road are electric vehicle, we should not be putting the tax gas problem on the backs of the EVs today. That was a near-term, it's a mistake, it's a Band-Aid fix for a much larger problem. I mean, the much larger problem, of course, I think, as most people know, is that the fuel economy is vastly improved from 20, 30 years ago when the gas tax was put in place. And it hasn't been adjusted for time. And so we're going back 20, 30 years when the fuel economy was really poor. There was a lot of revenue coming in to maintain our roads and bridges, and that's no longer the case. So the problem is actually 270 million light-duty vehicles worth. It's that fuel economy that's gotten so much better and has actually crippled the way we bring in revenue. I think that you have to look at an overhaul completely of the gas tax system. We may want to go to something with the vehicle miles traveled, a VMT that just says, you know what, how much are all of our vehicles on the road? Something fair like that is fair, and I don't think anyone objects to paying fair way, but sort of to punish consumers at the point when they are really the early adopters, taking a little bit of a step forward and getting the first EV in the neighborhood. I think it's the absolute wrong time to send a signal that says, you know what, but we're going to hit you with this thing that's not going to actually fix a problem in our states.
Right. Estella, there are several thousand miles between Washington and California, and probably several million in terms of corporate average fuel economy standards.
More and more every day.
Any thoughts on that?
A lot of thoughts, actually.
Yeah, we'll get the official administration position from Michael in just a moment.
Oh.
Well, I think, of course, you're alluding to the California waiver and the zero-emission vehicle program, which, frankly, has been very successful. Our point of view is that that's been one of the most effective mechanisms that California has been able to leverage in its efforts to try to combat climate change as well as pollution. I think that is going to play itself out in the political and legal arena, and we'll be watching in earnest to see which way it does. But I do lament the fact that engine manufacturers need to have some regulatory certainty. And so while we're busy trying to sort this out politically and legally, we are waiting and they are waiting, and in the meantime, the clock is ticking.
Right.
So I'm hopeful that we can come up with a solution. The authority that California had under its waiver was the result, I think, of a bipartisan effort under then Governor Reagan, at least the first waiver, and President Nixon signed the Clean Air Act into law, and so over time this has been a great success story where
Right.
I think states have been able to voluntarily commit to the same standards. And we've had some engine manufacturers stepping forward in recent months and years to really be progressive on this. We do still need to build the market, and regulation is a very good way to build that market. So I'm hopeful that we can resolve it.
I would observe that regardless of where you stand on the policy related to corporate average fuel economy, electric vehicles are good. I guess that would be win number 7 or something like that on the list, because when you have zero emission vehicles, that really does a lot of good things for corporate average fuel economy standards. Norm, did you have a comment you wanted to make from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, well, I think there's no right answer. I think there's a number of answers that are sort of right. So that's the value and the beauty of these pilot programs. It may well be that the IOUs in Michigan are finding that, well, the policy that they have is really, DC fast chargers are one of the critical issues, have to be resolved. Well, there's not enough money to go around to build as many DC fast chargers as what the drivers would want, what the utilities would want, what everyone would want. But looking at a variety of resources, Electrify America has had a tremendous impact, most states, if not all states. And so a lot of what they're doing in Michigan is to how do you parlay a number of different programs together to make DC fast chargers at the right locations. Okay, so I don't think that we can overlook the fact that we're going to stumble a little bit. You know, that as technology advances, it isn't what Louis Chevrolet first invented as what today's Volt, Bolt, and other Chevrolet products are, Corvette. But I think that when you see the direction that the industry is going with the diverse group of constituents, business, environmental, manufacturing, municipal organizations, governmental organizations, there's something in this thing. When you look at the rest of the world's success, Great Britain, more charging outlets than petrol stations now. I mean, this is, you talk about Norway, you talk about other nations. This is America, and we're going forward with it.
And maybe just a thought about a sales mandate, because the ZEV mandate is a sales mandate. It is very effective in getting a technology into a market. It forces products to get into the market. The problem right now is that there's nothing that's actually encouraging consumers other than the federal $7,500 tax credit, which is really good, but not everyone benefits from a tax credit. There's nothing that actually gets the consumers to react enough in the way you want. So we have to look at the demand side here too, as we look at the mandate side on the selling side. For sure.
Britta, as the General Motors person, you being formerly at least,
Careful.
so when Cadillac came out with its CTS, a great car, 10 plus years ago, their key advertising campaign was, when you turn the car on, does it return the favor? And I think that's what you need to find with electric vehicles now.
It's cute.
All kinds of possibilities there, Norm.
It's my marketing hat.
So we've got a few minutes. We've got a couple of questions in the back. Please introduce
you
yourself.
do such a
Social
Tom Kuhn with
security
the
number,
EI.
political party.
Tom Kuhn with the EI, independent. You do such a smooth job of running the panel, but 15 minutes ago you said you were out of questions and then kept on going, so I commend you for that. But I'd like to turn to Estelle a little bit because, part of the challenge here is to break the cord of people that are used to gasoline cars and they're worried about a lot of things. What can we do on the utility side to make that customer experience more smooth and help them, when they first get the car and bring it home, et cetera? What are the kind of things that I think around the industry we can do a lot better in that area?
Well, one thing that we didn't touch on that I think the utilities are able to do, in addition to coming up with ideas on how to deploy the infrastructure, I think that's a unique role that the utility can play. And the incentive of a tax credit is to offer pricing plans and rates that allow the consumer to smooth their electric bills. That's something that we are experimenting with in San Diego and in California and trying to figure out how best to leverage the price signals that we send to consumers. But utility rate structure is very complicated. It's very difficult for a consumer to understand, at least with time of use plans in California, when to plug in what and what to use and how to use their energy. So I think there's a lot of education and communication and thoughtful rate design that the utilities need to figure out, and there's probably some regionalization associated with that. I don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all across the country. But above and beyond that, our Clean Transportation Program is fairly aggressive in its efforts to hold ride and drive events. We just had the world's largest ride and drive last week or 2 weeks ago in San Diego. And we're finding that our customers are very excited about electric vehicles and driving electric vehicles, and they have a lot of questions about model availability, total costs of ownership, rate design. I think it's incumbent on us to try to distribute some of that information, and where possible partner with engine manufacturers and who are the salespeople here, as well as environmental organizations and other stakeholders.
Thanks, Estella. We have time for one more question over here.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Barbara Tyron with EPRI. Great panel, everybody. But my question is particularly for Britta, given your prior background. I read recently that the GM strike may be attributable somewhat to some anxiety in the workforce around EVs and that uncertain future. What does that mean? Any perspectives you can offer on that?
So I'm no longer with General Motors, so I don't speak officially, and I don't know. I don't have any insight on this thing. It did strike me as I was very surprised when I saw the linkage between the two. I happen to believe that it is a interesting point in time coincidence that in fact small cars are not selling. We make a lot of small cars that are, we, General Motors, the big three, make a lot of small cars that are unprofitable. EVs are also unprofitable right now. Some of that's designed into the process. New technology is always more expensive in the first few years. So I think that I believe it's just a poor timing coincidence of the reality of where the market is. And it's really unfortunate, honestly, that Americans in the last 6 years have swung so wildly away from the small vehicles that they were buying during the sort of the slowdown in the economy years, and they've just en masse gone over to the crossovers, the SUVs, and the pickup trucks. And that was really unfortunate. That was unexpected. And when you talk about CAFE and fuel economy, that was completely unanticipated, that Americans would again forget what it means to drive a vehicle that uses a lot of gasoline.
Yeah.
And so I think that is an unfortunate situation we're in.
So,
An unfair sort of claim, and should not stop us at all in moving forward.
we are going to do a very fast lightning round. Panelists, I want you to motivate this audience and tell them why it is so critical right now to support electric vehicles. Estella.
It's never been better to drive electric, and we're running out of time on climate change.
Michael.
The entire world is going there. I see it all over, and the U.S. can't be left behind.
It represents the best of the manufacturing in America.
Britta.
It's the only personal smart decision you can make.
Outstanding. You've been a great panelist. I've learned a lot, as has the audience. Thank you so much.
Nicely done.